The Commandant of the Marine Corps famously looked the president in the eye and said he would rather have 5,000 white Marines than 250,000 black ones. He didn't just doubt them, he was disgusted by them. So he sent the first black recruits to a swamp infested with bears and snakes, a hellhole designed to make them break, quit, and go home. He thought he was throwing away trash. He didn't realize he was forging steel. This is the story of the men who took the worst America had to offer and shoved it right back down history's throat. This is a piece of American history that was buried for 70 years. Before we dig it up, I want a roll call. I know the patriots are out there. Pause the video, go down to the comments right now, and drop your city and state. Let's see which part of the US is representing these heroes the hardest today. Rep your state in the comments, and let's get to work. Now, imagine America in 1941. The world is on fire. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor, dragging the United States into the most devastating conflict in human history. The nation is mobilizing. Young men from New York to Nebraska are lining up at recruitment offices, eager to fight fascism abroad. But for Black Americans, the fight against tyranny was a double-edged sword. They were being asked to die for a country that forced them to sit at the back of the bus, a country that lynched them for looking at a white woman the wrong way, a country that legally treated them as second-class citizens. Yet, driven by a complex patriotism and a desperate need to prove their equality, thousands of black men tried to enlist. They wanted to be pilots, they wanted to be sailors, and the bravest among them wanted to be Marines. But the Marine Corps door was bolted shut. For decades, the Corps had recruited exclusively from the white population, often targeting Southern boys who had grown up with guns and segregation. The culture of the Corps was steeped in the racial hierarchy of the Deep South. To a Marine recruiter in 1941, a black man was fit to be a servant, a cook, or a laborer, but never a rifleman, never a Marine. The rejection was swift and humiliating. Black volunteers were turned away at the door, told to go join the Army, or better yet, go home. But the pressure was mounting. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was facing a political crisis. Civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph were threatening a massive march on Washington to protest discrimination in the defense industries and the armed forces. The hypocrisy of fighting Hitler's racism with a segregated army was becoming a diplomatic nightmare. So, in June of 1941, FDR signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in the national defense industry. It was the first crack in the wall. Then, in 1942, under immense pressure, the president ordered the Marine Corps to begin recruiting African Americans. The reaction from the Marine Corps leadership was not obedience, it was resentment. They were being forced to integrate, and they hated it. General Holcomb was furious. He viewed this order not as progress, but as a pollution of his beloved Corps. But an order from the president is an order. The Corps had to comply. However, they decided that if they had to take black recruits, they would do it on their own terms. They would not be integrated into the existing training battalions at Parris Island or San Diego. They would not bunk with white recruits. They would be segregated, isolated, and hidden away. They chose a site in Jacksonville, North Carolina, separated from the main base at Camp Lejeune by a dense forest and a river. It was called Montford Point. To call it a military base would be a generous exaggeration. It was a swamp. It was a mosquito-infested, snake-ridden patch of wilderness that had been deemed unfit for white troops. When the first black recruits arrived in August of 1942, they didn't find barracks and mess halls waiting for them. They found thick brush, standing water, and bears roaming the perimeter. They found flimsy, cardboard-like huts that offered little protection from the sweltering humidity of the North Carolina summer or the biting cold of winter. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. We are putting you in the woods, out of sight, in the hopes that you will fail, that you will quit, that you will prove us right. The Marine Corps didn't just set the bar high, they rigged the game. They believed that by placing these men in intolerable conditions, the experiment would collapse, and they could go back to being a white-only club. The recruits who stepped off the bus at Montford Point came from all walks of life. They were sharecroppers from Mississippi, college students from Howard University, steelworkers from Pittsburgh. They arrived wearing their Sunday best, carrying suitcases filled with the hopes of their families. They expected the hard discipline of the Marines. What they got was a psychological assault. The white drill instructors assigned to train them were often the dregs of the Corps, men who had been demoted or punished and sent to Montford Point as a penalty. They were angry, they were racist, and they now had total control over the lives of black men. Imagine stepping off that bus. The air is thick enough to chew, smelling of pine pitch and swamp mud. The insects are swarming. And instantly, a white man in a Smokey Bear hat is in your face, screaming epithets that would make a civilian freeze. They were called every slur in the book. They were told they were monkeys, that they were stupid, that they were dirt. The instructors drove them harder than any white recruit at Parris Island. The physical abuse was constant. They were made to march until they collapsed, then kicked until they stood up again. They were forced to stand at attention while mosquitoes feasted on their faces, forbidden to twitch a muscle. But the Marine Corps had made a critical miscalculation. They thought that by treating these men like animals, they would break their spirits. They didn't understand the history of the men they were dealing with. These were men who had grown up in the shadow of Jim Crow. They knew what it meant to endure. They had been surviving in a hostile world since the day they were born. The brutality of Montford Point didn't break them. It hardened them. It forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel. They realized very quickly that they couldn't just be good Marines. They had to be perfect. If a white Marine scored an 80 on the rifle range, he passed. If a black Marine scored an 80, he was lazy. They had to score 100. They had to run faster, march longer, and shine their boots brighter than anyone else in the Corps. The first 1,200 recruits were the pioneers. They were the chosen few. They lived in a world of paradox. They were training to fight for freedom while living in a segregated camp in the South, where they could be arrested or beaten by local police just for walking into town wearing their uniforms. The local white population of Jacksonville viewed them with suspicion and hostility. A black man in a Marine uniform was seen as an affront to the social order. They had to fight a war just to get to the war. One of the most defining aspects of Montford Point was the wildlife. The recruits weren't just battling their instructors. They were battling nature. The camp was infested with venomous snakes, copperheads, rattlesnakes, water moccasins. Part of their training involved learning how to kill a snake with a shovel without breaking stride. They slept with one eye open, listening for the rustle of bears scavenging for food. The primitive conditions meant that disease was rampant. Dysentery and malaria were constant threats. Yet, the dropout rate was shockingly low. Why? Because they knew the world was watching. They knew that if they failed, the door would slam shut for every black man coming after them. They were carrying the weight of their entire race on their backs, along with their 70-pound packs. Among these first recruits were men like Gilbert Hashmark Johnson, a veteran of the Army and the Navy who joined the Marines because he wanted the toughest challenge available. He was older than the others, tougher than leather, and he would become one of the first black drill instructors, a legend who would shape the future of the Corps. There was Edgar Huff, who would eventually become the first black sergeant major in the Marine Corps. These men weren't just looking for a paycheck. They were looking for dignity. They were looking for a way to force America to respect them. As the training intensified, the white officers began to notice something unsettling. these men weren't quitting. In fact, they were excelling. Their drill formations were sharper than the white platoons at Lejeune. Their marksmanship scores were setting records. The experiment that was supposed to fail was producing some of the most disciplined, physically fit, and motivated Marines the Corps had ever seen. The hatred of the instructors slowly, grudgingly, began to turn into a confused respect. They were still racist, yes, but they were Marines first, and they knew a warrior when they saw one. They were trying to build a machine that would break, but instead, they had built a weapon. And soon, that weapon would be pointed toward the Pacific, where the true test of their resolve was waiting in the blood-soaked sands of islands they had never heard of. The swamp had failed to drown them. Now, the fire of war would try to consume them. By early 1943, the swamp at Montford Point had begun to change, not because the land had been tamed, but because the men inhabiting it had evolved. The initial shock of the abuse and the primitive conditions had worn off, replaced by a cold, hard callus of resolve. But the Marine Corps, still looking for a way to manage this problem of black integration, made a decision that would fundamentally alter the DNA of the Black Marine. The white drill instructors, many of whom had requested transfers to get away from the colored camp, were shipping out to the Pacific. The Corps needed new instructors to break in the fresh waves of recruits arriving every week. And for the first time in history, they looked within the ranks of the recruits themselves. This marked the rise of the black drill instructor, a figure who would become almost mythical in the lore of the Corps. Foremost among them was Sergeant Gilbert Hashmark Johnson. He was a man carved out of granite and old leather. He earned his nickname because his sleeve was stacked with service stripes, hash marks, from years in the Army and the Navy before he ever set foot in the Marines. He was in his 40s when he enlisted, old enough to be the father of most recruits, but he could outmarch, outshoot, and outfight men half his age. When Hashmark Johnson and men like Edgar Huff took over the training, the dynamic at Montford Point shifted. The white instructors had been brutal because they wanted the recruits to fail. They wanted to prove that black men didn't belong. Hashmark Johnson was brutal for a different reason. He was brutal because he knew that if these men weren't perfect, they would die. He knew that outside the gates of the camp, the world was looking for an excuse to crush them. He wasn't training them just to be Marines. He was training them to survive a country that hated them and an enemy that wanted to kill them. The training under Johnson was legendary for its severity. He would get inches from a recruit's face, his voice a gravelly roar, demanding absolute perfection. If a button was unpolished, if a bed was made with a wrinkle, the punishment was swift and exhausting. But there was a different undercurrent to his rage. It was a form of desperate, tough love. He would tell them, "I'm going to make you so hard that nothing the white man does can break you, and nothing the Japanese do can kill you." He was forging armor for their souls. Under his tutelage, Montford Point ceased to be a prison and began to feel like a monastery of war. They were a secret society, bonded by sweat and the shared knowledge that they were better than the men who commanded them. But as the 1st Battalions completed their training, a crushing realization set in. These men had endured the snakes, the bears, the dysentery, and the psychological torture. They had qualified as expert marksmen. They had mastered the bayonet and the machine gun. They stood tall in their dress blues, the eagle, globe, and anchor gleaming on their collars. They were Marines, but the Marine Corps still didn't view them as warriors. When the orders for deployment finally came down, they weren't for the elite infantry regiments. They weren't for the Raiders or the Paramarines. The 51st and 52nd Defense Battalions were formed, technically combat units, but tasked largely with holding ground far behind the front lines. Even worse, the vast majority of Montford Point Marines were assigned to depot companies and ammunition companies. The insult was devastating. In military speak, these were labor units. Their job was not to storm the beaches with rifles in hand, It was to carry the crates of bullets and beans for the white Marines who would get the glory. They were being treated as glorified stevedores, high-paid dock workers in uniform. The Corps was essentially saying, you can wear the emblem, but your place is still carrying the white man's luggage. The anger in the camp was palpable. Men who had joined to fight for their country felt betrayed. They had proven they were elite, yet they were being relegated to servant roles. But Hashmark Johnson and the other leaders gathered the men. They understood the long game. They told the troops that it didn't matter what the job description said on paper. They were going to the Pacific. They were going to the war. And in war, paper descriptions burn. They knew that once the bullets started flying, a Marine was a Marine, and the opportunity to fight would come whether the generals wanted it to or not. Before they shipped out, however, they had to survive one last enemy: the American South. Jacksonville, North Carolina, was a segregated town, and the sight of armed, confident black men in uniform was a trigger for the local white population. There were incidents that nearly spiraled into race riots. On weekends, when Marines were given liberty, they had to navigate a minefield of Jim Crow laws. They could be arrested for standing on the wrong side of the street, for looking a white woman in the eye, or simply for walking with too much pride. There is a story of a Montford Point Marine who was stopped by a local sheriff while waiting for a bus. The sheriff, offended by the man's uniform, demanded to know who he thought he was. The Marine, fresh from Hashmark Johnson's training, stood at rigid attention and replied, "I am a United States Marine." The sheriff struck him with a baton, but the Marine didn't flinch. He didn't fight back. Striking a white officer would have meant a lynching or a court-martial, but he didn't break. He took the blow, boarded his bus, and left the town behind. It was a quiet victory, a demonstration of the discipline that would soon save their lives in the Pacific. They learned to compartmentalize their rage, to store it away like ammunition for the real enemy. In 1843 and 1944, the Montford Point Marines began to ship out. They boarded transport ships that were essentially floating versions of the Jim Crow South. They were quartered in the bowels of the ships, near the noisy, sweltering engine rooms, while white troops occupied the upper decks. They were ordered to stay out of sight, to only come up for air at specific times. Even on the way to fight fascism, they were reminded of their second-class status. But as the ships cut through the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, approaching the islands with names like Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Peleliu, the mood shifted. The ocean didn't care about segregation. The Japanese Zeros buzzing overhead didn't check the skin color of the men manning the anti-aircraft guns. The ammunition and depot companies arrived at the islands often, just hours after the first waves of infantry. Their job was to unload the ships, to haul crates of mortar shells, grenades, and rations from the landing craft to the beachheads. It was backbreaking, dangerous work. They were unarmed, or lightly armed, expected to act as mules while the battle raged just yards away. The white Marines, digging into the sand, pinned down by withering Japanese machine gun fire, looked back at these black men struggling with heavy crates and initially saw them with the same prejudice they had back home. They called them supply boys. They yelled at them to hurry up. But the geography of the Pacific War was unique. There were no front lines in the traditional sense. On tiny islands like Saipan and Iwo Jima, the entire island was the front line. The Japanese defenders didn't play by the rules of Western warfare. They infiltrated. They attacked from tunnels and caves. They launched banzai charges at night, screaming out of the darkness to overrun rear positions. This was the moment the Montford Point Marines had been waiting for. This was the moment the paper description of their jobs disintegrated. The first time a Japanese sniper opened fire on an ammunition dump, or a squad of Japanese soldiers broke through the lines and charged the supply depots, the white Marines witnessed a transformation. The supply boys didn't run. They didn't cower behind their crates. Instead, they dropped the boxes. They picked up their rifles. Rifles they had been trained to use with lethal precision by Hashmark Johnson. They set up perimeters. They returned fire with a discipline and ferocity that stunned the white infantrymen. They transitioned from laborers to warriors in the blink of an eye. On Saipan, when a massive Japanese counterattack threatened to push the Americans back into the sea, the depot companies were right there in the thick of it. They held their ground, firing until their barrels glowed hot, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with cargo hooks and entrenching tools. The white Marines saw black men dragging wounded white soldiers to safety under fire. They saw black men manning machine guns after the white crews had been killed. In the chaos of the island-hopping campaign, the segregation began to blur. A bullet doesn't discriminate, and neither does shrapnel. When a mortar round hits, red blood looks the same on black skin as it does on white. In the foxholes of the Pacific, under the relentless tropical sun and the constant threat of death, the Montford Point Marines were quietly, violently rewriting the rules of the United States military. They were proving that the only thing that mattered was whether the man next to you would hold the line. And the men from Montford Point, the men from the swamp, they held the line. They held it like their lives depended on it, because they knew that the future of their entire race was dug into that sand with them. But the greatest test, the bloodiest sand, was yet to come. An island made of black ash and sulfur was waiting, a place called Iwo Jima, where the concept of rear echelon would vanish entirely into a slaughterhouse of fire. As 1944 burned on, the war in the Pacific transformed into a rhythmic, horrifying cycle of amphibious assaults. The strategy was called island hopping, a name that sounds almost lighthearted, like a children's game. In reality, it was a meat grinder. The geography of hell was composed of coral reefs, volcanic ash, and jungle rot. And on every single one of these islands, Peleliu, Guam, Tinian, the Montford Point Marines were the backbone that kept the American war machine from collapsing under its own weight. To understand their contribution, you have to understand the logistics of an invasion. An infantryman can storm a beach, but he only carries enough ammunition for a few minutes of sustained firefight. He carries enough water for a day, maybe two. Without a constant, unbroken stream of supplies from the ships to the shore, and from the shore to the front lines, the invasion stalls. And if the invasion stalls on a beach zeroed in by Japanese artillery, everyone dies. This was the burden placed on the shoulders of the depot and ammunition companies. The white commanders called them labor troops, a term dripping with dismissal. But on the island of Peleliu, labor meant sprinting across an airfield exposed to direct machine gun fire, carrying an 80-pound crate of mortar shells because the white infantry unit on the other side was about to be overrun. Labor meant driving amphibious tractors, the Amtraks, through choppy, blood-stained water, delivering fresh troops into the teeth of the enemy defenses and carrying the shattered bodies of the wounded back out. Peleliu was supposed to be a quick operation, a 3-day fight. It turned into a 2-month nightmare of attrition. The temperature on the coral rocks reached 115 degrees. The landscape was a moonscape of blasted white coral that magnified the heat and shredded boots. The Montford Point Marines of the 16th Field Depot were tasked with keeping the flow of supplies moving, but the Japanese had changed their tactics. They stopped doing banzai charges and started digging in, creating a labyrinth of caves and tunnels. They targeted the supply lines specifically. There is a famous account from Peleliu that encapsulates the insanity of their position. A white Marine captain, his company pinned down and running low on ammo, radioed back frantically for resupply. He didn't care who brought it, he just needed bullets. A squad of black Marines from the ammunition company volunteered. They loaded up, strapping bandoliers of ammunition across their chests, grabbing crates of grenades. They didn't have the cover of tanks or the support of artillery. They just ran. They ran through a gauntlet of sniper fire that had already killed a dozen men. When they reached the front line, they didn't just drop the ammo and leave. They stayed. They unslung their rifles and joined the line, firing side by side with the white Marines they had just saved. For those white Marines, the ideology of segregation died in that foxhole. You cannot look at a man who just ran through hell to bring you the means to survive and still think of him as inferior. You cannot listen to the sound of his M1 Garand cracking next to yours, dropping the same enemy, and believe he doesn't belong. In the intimacy of combat, the racial slurs evaporated, replaced by a gritty, survivalist brotherhood. The Black Marines were given a new nickname by some of the white infantrymen. They were called the Black Angels, because when they showed up, it meant you were going to live. But the heroism wasn't just in fighting, it was in the saving. The ammunition companies often doubled as stretcher bearers. This is perhaps the most psychologically complex job in warfare. To be a stretcher bearer is to walk unarmed into a kill zone, to lift a screaming, bleeding man onto a canvas litter, and to carry him steadily back to safety while bullets snap around your head. It requires a selflessness that borders on the divine. On Guam, the Montford Point Marines carried thousands of wounded white men off the ridges. Imagine the dynamic. A white boy from Alabama, raised to believe that a black man shouldn't even look him in the eye, is lying in the mud, his legs shattered by a Japanese mortar. He is bleeding out, terrified, crying for his mother, and the face that appears above him, the hands that gently lift him, the voice that tells him, "I got you, Marine. You're going home," belongs to a black man. In that moment, the white Marine isn't checking the color of his savior's skin. He is clinging to him like a lifeline. This dynamic played out thousands of times. Black Marines carried the very men who would have forced them to sit in the back of the bus back home. They saved the lives of men who used the N-word as casual punctuation. It was a supreme act of moral superiority. They weren't just saving American lives. They were saving the soul of the country, one wounded bigot at a time. But let's not romanticize the reception they received from the brass. While individual white Marines on the line were gaining respect, the institutional racism remained rigid. On the ships between invasions, the segregation was strictly enforced. Black Marines were often given the worst duties: cleaning the latrines, chipping paint, working in the sweltering galleys. They were often denied combat awards they had clearly earned. Acts of valor that would have earned a white Marine a Silver Star or a Navy Cross were often written off for Black Marines as just doing their job. And then there was the issue of the Japanese propaganda. The Japanese knew about America's racial divide. They dropped leaflets specifically targeting the black troops. "Why fight for the white man who lynches you?" the leaflets asked. "This is a white man's war. Join us, the colored people of Asia." It was a seductive argument, logical in its own twisted way. But the Japanese didn't understand the Montford Point Marines. They weren't fighting for the white man. They were fighting for their own stake in America. They were fighting for the right to look their children in the eye and say, "I paid the price for your freedom." Not a single Montford Point Marine is recorded as having defected. Their loyalty to a country that betrayed them was a weapon the Japanese couldn't counter. As the American war machine rolled closer to Japan, the battles became more desperate. On the island of Saipan, the 52nd Defense Battalion, a black combat unit, finally got to use the heavy weaponry they had trained on. They manned the anti-aircraft guns and the heavy artillery. When Japanese aircraft swooped down to strafe the beaches, it was black gunners who filled the sky with flak. When Japanese infantry tried to flank the Marine positions, it was black artillerymen who rained high explosives on their heads. They proved that they could handle the complex mathematics of ballistics and the mechanical intricacies of heavy ordnance just as well as any white unit. But the ultimate test was looming on the horizon. By early 1945, the United States had set its sights on a small pear-shaped island just 750 miles from Tokyo. It was a volcanic rock, smelling of sulfur and death, honeycombed with 11 miles of tunnels and bunkers. The Japanese commander, General Kuribayashi, had turned it into the most heavily fortified position in the history of warfare. He had ordered his men to kill 10 Americans before they died. The island was Iwo Jima. The buildup to Iwo Jima was unlike anything the Marines had seen. The armada of ships stretched to the horizon, and in the bellies of those ships were the Montford Point Marines. By this time, the Corps had realized they needed every able-bodied man on the beach. The distinction between combat and labor was about to be erased completely by the sheer scale of the slaughter that was coming. The 8th Ammunition Company and the 33rd, 34th, and 36th Depot Companies were briefed. They were told this would be rough. They were told to expect heavy casualties, but no briefing could prepare them for the reality of Iwo Jima. They weren't going to be in the rear, because on Iwo Jima, there was no rear. The entire island was a kill zone. As they checked their gear in the cramped holds of the transport ships, sharpening bayonets and writing letters home that might never be read, the men of Montford Point felt a heavy, somber resolve. They had survived the swamp. They had survived the abuse of their own drill instructors. They had survived the jungles of Peleliu and the snipers of Guam. They were hardened veterans now. They looked at each other, scars on their skin, hash marks on their sleeves, and they knew. They knew that they were about to walk into the fire that would either forge them into legends or turn them into ash. The white officers told them to keep their heads down and unload the ships. But Hashmark Johnson's voice echoed in their minds. "You are Marines," he had told them, "and Marines fight." As the landing craft circled in the rough waters, waiting for the signal to head toward the smoking black shoreline of Iwo Jima, the Black Marines checked their rifles one last time. They weren't going ashore to carry boxes. They were going ashore to take their place in history. And God help anyone, Japanese soldier or American bigot, who tried to stand in their way. The supply boys were coming, and they were bringing hell with them. February 19th, 1945. D-Day on Iwo Jima. It wasn't a beach. It was a slaughterhouse floor covered in coarse, black volcanic ash. The sand was so soft that a man would sink up to his ankles with every step, making running impossible. It was like trying to sprint through a nightmare made of quicksand. And waiting above them, hidden inside the hollowed-out mountain of Suribachi and the rocky plateaus to the north, were 21,000 Japanese defenders who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. They had zeroed every inch of that beach with artillery, mortars, and machine guns. They weren't shooting at random. They were shooting into a barrel. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, the Montford Point Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company and the Depot Companies didn't charge into a traditional battle. They charged into a catastrophe. The white infantry waves ahead of them had stalled, pinned down by a wall of steel. The beaches were clogged with wrecked vehicles, burning tanks, and the shredded bodies of Marines. And into this chaotic, churning kill zone, the Black Marines were ordered to land. Their mission was to bring the supplies, the lifeblood of the invasion, ashore. But on Iwo Jima, the shore was the target. The Japanese commander, General Kuribayashi, had a specific strategy. Let the Americans land, let the beaches fill up with men and material, and then unleash hell. As the Black Marines struggled through the surf, dragging pallets of ammunition and crates of blood plasma, the artillery rain began. It was a deafening, earth-shaking barrage that turned the black sand into a geyser of death. There was no cover. You couldn't dig a foxhole because the sand just collapsed back in on itself. You could only press your body against the hot, sulfur-smelling earth and pray that the next shell had someone else's name on it. For the men of the 8th Ammunition Company, the distinction between combat and service evaporated in the first 5 minutes. A non-combatant on Iwo Jima was a myth. If you were breathing, you were a target, and if you were a target, you had to fight back. As Japanese snipers picked off officers and machine gun crews, the Black Marines dropped their crates and picked up their carbines. They didn't need orders. They saw their brothers, white Marines they had been separated from on the ships, dying in droves. The instinct forged by Hashmark Johnson took over. They returned fire, spotting the muzzle flashes in the rocks and suppressing the enemy so the infantry could move. But their primary job was even more dangerous than the fighting. They had to keep the invasion moving. Imagine the physical feat required. The sand was loose, like piles of coffee grounds. Vehicles bogged down instantly. The only way to get ammo to the front lines was by hand. The Montford Point Marines formed human chains, lines of men stretching from the waterline up the terraces of the beach. They passed heavy crates of mortar shells, grenades, and .30 caliber bullets hand to hand, bucket brigade style, while shrapnel screamed through the air around them. If a man in the line was hit, he was dragged aside, and another man stepped into his place. The chain could not break. If the chain broke, the white Marines a few hundred yards inland would run out of ammo and be overrun. This was the reality of Iwo Jima that the newsreels often missed. The iconic image of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi captures the glory, but it doesn't capture the grit required to get that flag there. While the flag went up, Black Marines were down on the beach, dodging mortar fire to deliver the very bullets that cleared the path for that summit. Without the 8th Ammunition Company, the flag doesn't go up. It's that simple. The segregation that defined their lives back in America was mocked by the reality of the island. A Japanese mortar shell doesn't check for Jim Crow laws. When the white Marines on the line screamed for ammo, they didn't care if the hand passing it to them was black, white, or purple. They just grabbed the bandolier and kept firing. There are countless stories from Iwo Jima of white Marines, pinned down and terrified, looking back to see a Black Marine crawling on his belly through the ash, dragging a crate of grenades. The look in their eyes wasn't hate, it was salvation. One of the most harrowing tasks fell to the black drivers of the DUKWs, the amphibious trucks. These men had to navigate the rough surf, dodging submerged wrecks and mines to ferry supplies from the ships to the beach. Once they hit the shore, they were sitting ducks. A DUKW is a slow, large target. Japanese gunners loved them. Black drivers would steer their vehicles through a curtain of exploding water, drive right up onto the killing fields, unload under fire, and then load up with the wounded to take back to the hospital ships. And that was the other half of their job, the harvest of the broken. As they brought ammo in, they took the wounded out. This intimacy with the carnage changed everyone involved. When a Black Marine lifts a shattered white boy onto a stretcher, wiping the ash from his face, whispering words of comfort, a bond is formed that transcends centuries of social conditioning. The white Marine, in his delirium of pain, sees only a brother. The Black Marine, seeing the vulnerability of the master race, realizes the lie of white supremacy has been exposed by the fragility of human flesh. They bled the same color, red, into the same black sand. The casualties among the Montford Point Marines were staggering. Because they were working on the beaches, the primary target for Japanese artillery, they took a pounding. Officers and enlisted men alike were cut down, but the discipline held. They didn't break. They didn't run back to the water. They stayed and did the work. Roland Martin, a Montford Point Marine on Iwo Jima, later recalled, "We were all Marines. We were all Americans. We were all scared, but we all did our job." There is a profound irony in the fact that on Iwo Jima, The only place where integration truly existed was in the mass graves. When the bodies were collected, the initial segregation of the cemetery plots eventually broke down under the sheer volume of the dead. Black and white Marines were buried in the same soil, thousands of miles from a country that wouldn't let them drink from the same water fountain. As the battle raged for 36 days, the supply troops found themselves constantly on the front lines. The Japanese infiltrators didn't care about unit designations. At night, they would slip through the lines to attack the command posts and supply dumps. The Black Marines fought hand-to-hand in the dark, using knives and entrenching tools to defend their positions. They proved, night after night, that they were not just laborers. They were infantrymen who happened to be carrying boxes. By the time the island was declared secure, the reputation of the Black Marines had shifted tectonically within the Corps. The Commandant, General Vandegrift, who had succeeded Holcomb, famously said, "The Negro Marines are no longer on trial. They are Marines, period." It was a grudging admission, perhaps, but it was an admission nonetheless. They had paid the blood price. They had earned the title. But the war wasn't over. Iwo Jima was just the doorstep. The house itself, the Japanese homeland, was still heavily defended, and the final stepping stone was an island called Okinawa. If Iwo Jima was a slaughterhouse, Okinawa would be a meat grinder of apocalyptic proportions. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater and the last stop before the invasion of Japan itself. The Montford Point Marines who survived Iwo Jima didn't get to go home to a parade. They patched their wounds, restocked their supplies, and boarded the ships again. They were tired. Their eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of men who have seen too much. But there was a new swagger in their step. They knew who they were now. They weren't the nervous recruits stepping off the bus into the North Carolina swamp anymore. They were veterans of the Black Sands. They had looked death in the face and hadn't blinked. As the fleet turned toward Okinawa in April 1945, the Montford Point Marines were distributed across the entire invasion force. The 1st and 3rd Ammunition Companies, the depot companies, they were all there. Okinawa was different. It was populated. It had cities, civilians, and a Japanese army that knew this was their last stand. The fighting would be different too. It wouldn't just be on beaches. It would be in the mud, in the rain, through tombs and ridges. And the threat from the sky, the kamikazes, would turn the fleet into a ring of fire. The Black Marines on the ships manning the anti-aircraft guns watched as planes turned into human missiles, crashing into carriers and destroyers. They stayed at their posts, filling the sky with lead, protecting the white sailors and Marines who depended on them. On the ground, the depot companies once again found themselves in the thick of the fighting, tasked with supplying an army that was chewing through ammunition at an unprecedented rate. But on Okinawa, the sheer length of the battle, 82 days of rain and mud, tested their endurance to the breaking point. The racial tensions that had subsided in the heat of Iwo Jima sometimes flared up again during the long, miserable stalemates in the mud. Yet, the shared misery of the typhoon of steel continued to erode the old barriers. White Marines saw Black Marines driving trucks through monsoon rains, on roads that were little more than rivers of sludge to bring them hot chow and dry socks. They saw them acting as decoys, drawing fire, and holding defensive lines against night attacks. The Montford Point Marines were becoming the glue that held the logistics of the Pacific War together. Without them, the island-hopping strategy would have ground to a halt. They were the unsung, unglamorous, absolutely essential muscle of the Marine Corps, and as the war entered its final, most desperate phase, they were about to face a new kind of challenge, the challenge of victory, and the question of whether the country they had fought for would finally welcome them home. They had conquered the swamp, the prejudice of their instructors, and the Japanese Empire. Now, they had to conquer the memory of a nation that wanted to forget they were ever there. The end of the war didn't come with a cheer. It came with a flash. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the Montford Point Marines were deep in the mud of Okinawa, or refitting on the staging islands, preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of mainland Japan. The casualty estimates for that invasion were terrifying. The War Department expected 1 million American casualties. Every black Marine checking his rifle knew that he would be in the first wave of that slaughter. The depot and ammunition companies would be hitting the beaches of Tokyo and Kyushu, fighting a population armed with bamboo spears and a death wish. So when the word came down the line, the Japs surrendered. It's over. The reaction wasn't jubilation. It was a stunning, knee-buckling relief. The silence that followed the ceasefire was the loudest thing they had ever heard. For 3 years, their world had been the roar of artillery, the scream of aircraft, and the crack of rifles. Now, there was just the wind and the ocean. They had survived. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and they were still standing. But the end of combat operations brought a new, strange chapter. The occupation. The 8th Ammunition Company and others were sent to the Japanese mainland, to places like Sasebo and Yokosuka. Imagine the scene. Black men, who in their own country were forbidden from eating in certain restaurants or voting in elections, were now walking the streets of a defeated empire as conquerors. They stood guard over Japanese cities that had been leveled by American power. They disarmed Japanese soldiers who bowed to them. For the first time in their lives, they held a position of absolute authority over a population that wasn't black. It was a surreal inversion of the social order they knew back home. In Japan and China, where many Montford Point Marines were deployed to repatriate Japanese troops, they experienced a freedom that was dizzying. The local populations didn't have the centuries-old baggage of American racism. To a Japanese civilian, a Marine was a Marine. They were treated with a mixture of fear and respect, but rarely with the specific, dehumanizing contempt of Jim Crow. Black Marines walked down the streets of Nagasaki without stepping into the gutter for anyone. They realized, thousands of miles from home, that the cage of racism was an American construction, not a universal law of nature. This taste of respect was intoxicating, but it was also dangerous. It made the idea of going back to colored-only water fountains intolerable. By late 1945 and 1946, the ships began to turn east, heading back toward San Diego and San Francisco. This was the moment they had dreamed of in the foxholes of Iwo Jima. Going back to the world, they called it. They polished their buttons. They pressed their dress blues until the creases were sharp enough to cut skin. They pinned their campaign ribbons on their chests, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, the Presidential Unit citations. They looked like heroes. They felt like heroes. They had defeated fascism. Surely, they thought, America would see them differently now. They were wrong. The ship ride home was the first sign. As soon as the coast of California appeared on the horizon, the military hierarchy snapped back into place. The brotherhood of the foxhole evaporated as white officers reminded black troops to stay in their designated areas. But the real blow came when they stepped off the ships. There were bands playing. Yes, there were crowds cheering. But often, those cheers were for the white units marching in front of them. When the parade ended, the reality of 1946 America hit them like a truncheon. There are thousands of stories from this period, each one a scar on the soul of the greatest generation. A Montford Point Marine, fresh from the hell of Okinawa, walking into a diner in San Diego and being told, "We don't serve your kind here." A veteran in uniform, carrying his sea bag, trying to catch a bus in Mississippi and being beaten by the driver for trying to sit in the front rows. A group of Marines returning to North Carolina, having risked their lives for the Constitution, being pulled over by state troopers and humiliated on the side of the road just to remind them who was boss. The Double V campaign, victory abroad and victory at home, had won only half the battle. The Nazis and the Imperial Japanese Army were gone, but Jim Crow was alive and well, and he was angry. The white establishment in the South, and in many parts of the North, was terrified of these returning black veterans. They saw black men who knew how to shoot, who knew how to organize, and who had lost their fear of death. To the racists, a black man in a Marine uniform wasn't a patriot. He was a threat. He was uppity. And he needed to be put back in his place. The violence against returning black veterans in 1946 was a national epidemic. Isaac Woodard, a Black Army sergeant, not a Marine, but his story resonated with every black service member, was pulled off a bus in South Carolina while still in uniform and blinded by a police chief with a billy club. This was the welcome home. For the Montford Point Marines, the psychological whiplash was devastating. They had gone from being the Black Angels of Peleliu to being boys and niggers in their own hometowns. Many of them simply took off the uniform and never spoke of it again. The pain of the rejection was too great. They hid their medals and shoeboxes in the attic. They went back to the steel mills, the farms, and the rail yards. When people asked them what they did in the war, they would mumble, "I was in the service," and leave it at that. They didn't want to explain that they were Marines to people who wouldn't believe them anyway. The Marine Corps, after all, was still seen in the public imagination as a white man's outfit. John Wayne movies didn't show black faces on the sands of Iwo Jima. The erasure had already begun, but not everyone left. Some stayed. The old salts like Hashmark Johnson and Edgar Huff remained in the Corps. They were determined to hold the ground they had taken. They knew that the only way to ensure the door didn't slam shut again was to stand in the doorway. They became the career NCOs who would train the next generation. And change was coming, whether the old guard liked it or not. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the armed forces. It was a piece of paper, just like the Emancipation Proclamation had been, but it had the force of the Commander-in-Chief behind it. The Marine Corps, the most resistant of all the branches, dragged its feet. They claimed integration would hurt morale. They claimed it couldn't be done. But Montford Point had already proven it could be done. In 1949, Montford Point Camp was officially deactivated. The segregated training was over. Black recruits were finally sent to Parris Island and San Diego to train alongside white recruits. This sounds like a victory, and in the history books, it is often framed as the happy ending. But for the men of Montford Point, it was a bittersweet moment. The closing of the camp meant the end of segregation, yes, but it also meant the dispersal of their brotherhood. The Montford Point Marine ceased to be a category of recruit and became a memory, a distinct and closed chapter of history. The integration process was rough. The first black recruits at Parris Island faced a loneliness that the Montford Pointers hadn't. At Montford, they were all black. They had each other. At Parris Island, a black recruit might be the only one in his platoon, isolated in a sea of white faces, a prime target for abuse without the buffer of a shared struggle. But the Montford Point Marines who stayed in the Corps became the guardians of these new recruits. They were the sergeants and the gunnies who whispered advice, who intervened when the hazing got too dangerous, who modeled the excellence required to survive. Men like Sergeant Major Edgar Huff became legends not just to Black Marines, but to the whole Corps. Huff was a tower of a man, a drill instructor who terrified recruits of all colors, but who was fair. He forced the Marine Corps to judge men by their performance, not their pigment. Yet, as the 1950s dawned and the Korean War approached, the legacy of the 20,000 men who had trained at the swamp was already fading. The Marine Corps was eager to project an image of unity, which meant burying the history of its segregation. The story of the ammunition companies on Iwo Jima wasn't taught in boot camp. The struggles of the depot companies on Okinawa weren't celebrated in the Marine Corps birthday messages. The Montford Point Marines were becoming ghosts in their own house. They had saved the Corps when it needed manpower. They had saved white lives when the lines broke. They had integrated the most exclusive club in the American military through sheer force of will. And their reward was silence. They returned to a society that was entering the deep freeze of the Cold War and the hot boil of the Civil Rights Movement. They were men who had fought for democracy abroad and now had to fight for basic human rights at home. But they had a secret weapon: the discipline, the toughness. The Montford Point swagger. You could spot them in a crowd, even out of uniform. They walked straighter. They looked you in the eye. They didn't back down. They became the deacons in the churches, the leaders in the NAACP chapters, the fathers who told their sons, "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't be." They took the fire of the Corps and used it to fuel the long march towards civil rights. They didn't know it yet, but their fight wasn't over. The war for their legacy, for the acknowledgement of what they had done, would take longer than World War II and Korea combined. It would take nearly 70 years for their country to finally, truly say, "Thank you." And many of them wouldn't live to hear it. If World War II was the baptism by fire for the Black Marine, the Korean War was the confirmation. In 1950, when the North Korean army poured across the 38th parallel, the Marine Corps was still dragging its feet on integration. General headquarters was technically desegregated, but in the barracks and the mess halls, the old divides lingered. The Corps was trying to figure out how to mix oil and water without causing an explosion. But war, as it always does, forced the issue with a brutality that ignored politics. When the Marines landed at Incheon and fought their way to the Chosin Reservoir, the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The ground was frozen harder than granite. Weapons jammed, vehicles wouldn't start, and morphine syrettes had to be kept in a medic's mouth to keep them from freezing solid. And then the Chinese army attacked. Human waves of hundreds of thousands of soldiers swarming over the frozen hills, bugles blowing in the terrifying dark. In that frozen hell, the last vestiges of resistance to integration shattered. You cannot be a racist when you are encircled and outnumbered 10 to 1. You cannot care about the color of the man sharing your sleeping bag when body heat is the only thing keeping you from freezing to death. The Montford Point veterans, now the old salts, the gunnery sergeants and staff sergeants, were the ones holding the line. This was a revolutionary moment in American social history, playing out on a frozen mountain in Asia. For the first time, you had black non-commissioned officers giving orders to white privates in the heat of combat. Imagine a 19-year-old white kid from rural Alabama, raised in a town where a black man had to step off the sidewalk for him. Now, he is in a foxhole at the frozen Chosin, terrified, his hands numb, the enemy closing in, and the man pacing the line, the man checking his ammo, the man screaming, "Hold your fire until you see the whites of their eyes," is a black Marine from Montford Point. And that white kid doesn't question him. He doesn't rebel. He says, "Aye, Sergeant," and he does exactly what he is told, because he knows that Black Sergeant is the only thing standing between him and a shallow, frozen grave. The Montford Point Marines in Korea were the glue that held the first to fight together. They were the heavy machine gunners, the truck drivers running the gauntlet of Hellfire Valley, the corpsmen treating frostbite and shrapnel wounds indiscriminately. Men like Sergeant Major Edgar Huff and Sergeant Major Hashmark Johnson were there, their presence a stabilizing force for a generation of Marines who had never known a segregated corps. They proved that leadership is not a racial trait. It is a byproduct of experience, discipline, and character. But as the 1950s rolled into the 1960s and the conflict shifted to the steaming jungles of Vietnam, a strange phenomenon occurred. The Black Marine had become a common sight in the ranks. By Vietnam, the Marine Corps was arguably the most integrated institution in America, far ahead of corporate boardrooms or university faculties. Black Marines were serving in force recon, flying helicopters, and commanding platoons. The legacy of Montford Point had seemingly succeeded. The Corps was integrated. However, outside the military, the story of how this happened was being systematically erased. In the explosion of World War II movies and books that defined the post-war American imagination, the Black Marine was invisible. Watch the classic war movies of the 50s and 60s, Sands of Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal Diary, The Halls of Montezuma. You will see John Wayne. You will see thousands of white faces storming the beaches. You might see a black soldier in the background unloading a truck if you look hard enough, but you will never see the Black Marines fighting with rifles. You will never see the 8th Ammunition Company holding the line. Hollywood and the history books sanitized the Corps. They presented a monochrome version of heroism. For the Montford Point veterans watching these movies in theater balconies or on their living room televisions, the pain was visceral. It was a form of gaslighting on a national scale. They had been there. They had the shrapnel scars and the nightmares to prove it. But their country was telling a story of the greatest generation that didn't include them. They were being written out of their own history while they were still alive. This erasure had a profound psychological cost. It robbed the Black community of its heroes. A young Black boy growing up in Chicago or Detroit in 1965 knew who Joe Louis was. He knew who Jackie Robinson was. But he didn't know that men who looked like him had stormed the black sands of Iwo Jima. He didn't know that the toughness of the Marines was forged partly in the struggle of Black men to survive Montford Point. This lack of representation reinforced the lie that Black people were passive beneficiaries of freedom, not active warriors who had fought and died to secure it. The veterans themselves largely stayed silent. They were part of a generation that didn't complain. They were proud men, dignified men. They didn't want to beg for recognition. They had their discharge papers, their Purple Hearts in the drawer, and their memories. They formed the Montford Point Marine Association in 1965, a fraternal organization designed to keep the bond alive. But for decades, it remained a small, insular group. They met in church basements and VFW halls, telling stories that the rest of the world didn't want to hear. Meanwhile, the skills and discipline they had learned at Montford Point were being deployed on a new battlefield, the civil rights movement. While they weren't always the guys with the megaphones, they were often the guys providing the security. They were the organizers, the discipline of the Corps, the ability to stand stoic in the face of abuse, the ability to organize logistics, the refusal to be intimidated by fear, translated perfectly to the struggle for justice. Look at the photos of the civil rights marches. Look at the men in the suits, standing tall, distinct from the crowd. Often, those were veterans. They had faced the banzai charges of the Japanese army. They weren't going to be scared off by a fat sheriff with a fire hose. They instilled a militant self-respect in their communities. They taught their sons and daughters that they were second to no one. But as the 70s, 80s, and 90s passed, the clock became the new enemy. The old salts were dying. Hashmark Johnson passed away. The men who had stood in the swamp in 1942 were becoming old men with canes and failing memories. The window to capture their history, to give them their due while they were still here to receive it, was closing rapidly. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that the tide began to turn. A new generation of historians, filmmakers, and Marine leaders, both black and white, began to dig into the archives. They found the muster rolls. They found the after-action reports from Saipan and Iwo Jima that mentioned the Negro troops performing with valor. They realized that a massive chunk of Marine Corps heritage had been left to rot. The push for recognition didn't come from the top down initially. It came from the bottom up. It came from the families of the veterans who wanted their grandfathers' stories told. It came from active duty Black Marines who wanted to know whose shoulders they were standing on. And it came from a Marine Corps that was finally ready to grapple with its own flawed history. General James F. Amos, the 35th Commandant of the Marine Corps, made it a personal mission. He realized that the Corps prided itself on its history, on the legacy of Belleau Wood and Tarawa, but it had a hole in its soul where Montford Point should be. He understood that you cannot claim to be a brotherhood if you deny the existence of your brothers. The campaign to award the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow, began. It was a race against time. Every week, another Montford Point Marine was buried without the honors he deserved. The organizers scoured the country, trying to find these men. It was a detective story. The records from the 1940s were incomplete or lost. Many men had changed their names or moved, but they found them. They found them in nursing homes, in quiet suburban houses, in VA hospitals. When they told these old warriors, men in their 80s and 90s, that the country wanted to honor them, many of them wept, not out of joy, but out of a release of 70 years of held breath. They had carried the weight of the experiment for a lifetime. They had carried the secret knowledge of their own worth in a country that denied it. And finally, someone was saying, "We see you. We know what you did." But even as the momentum for the gold medal built, the question remained, was it too little, too late? Could a medal wipe away the memory of the swamp? Could a ceremony in Washington undo the sting of being called boy while wearing the uniform of the United States? The answer, of course, is no. Nothing can undo the past. But acknowledgement has a power of its own. It doesn't fix the wound, but it stops the bleeding. It validates the sacrifice. As we move toward the climax of this story, we have to look at what happened on that day in Washington in 2012. It wasn't just a ceremony. It was a resurrection. It was the moment when the ghosts of Montford Point finally walked out of the shadows and into the rotunda of the Capitol, not as servants, not as supply boys, but as the giants they had always been. But before we get to the gold, we have to acknowledge the iron that forged it. We have to look at the legacy they left within the Corps itself. The unbroken line of Black excellence that leads from the swamp of 1942 directly to the highest echelons of American military power today. They didn't just integrate the Corps, they saved it from its own worst instincts, and they did it without asking for a thank you. To truly measure the impact of the Montford Point Marines, you cannot just look at the beaches of Iwo Jima. You have to look at the chain of command. For the first 170 years of the Marine Corps, the idea of a Black man holding a commission, being an officer, a gentleman by act of Congress, a man whom white enlisted men were required by law to salute, was anathema. It was the final line the white establishment refused to cross. They could, under duress, accept a Black man pulling a trigger, but they could not accept a Black man giving an order. That hierarchy was the bedrock of American racism. The man who took a sledgehammer to that bedrock was Frederick C. Branch. He was a Montford Point Marine, a man who had survived the swamp and the prejudice. While serving in the Pacific with a supply unit, his conduct was so exemplary that he was recommended for officer candidate school. This was a radical move. In 1944, sending a Black man to the elite training grounds at Quantico, Virginia, to train alongside the sons of senators and admirals was almost unthinkable. But the performance of the Montford Point Marines had created a pressure that could no longer be contained. Branch went to Purdue University for the Navy's V-12 program, the only Black student in his class, and made the dean's list. He went to Quantico and navigated a minefield of scrutiny. Every time he shined his shoes, every time he took a test, he knew that a single slip-up would not just end his career. It would be used as evidence that Negroes aren't officer material. He carried the weight of the entire race in his backpack. On November 10th, 1945, on the birthday of the Marine Corps, Frederick C. Branch was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Visualizing that moment reveals its seismic power. A black man in the dress whites of a Marine officer walking onto a base. A white private, perhaps a boy from Mississippi who had never called a black man anything but boy, sees the gold bars on Branch's collar. The private snaps to attention. He raises his hand in a sharp salute. It is a gesture of subordination, of respect, mandated by military law. In that split second, the entire social architecture of the Jim Crow South is inverted. The white man submits to the authority of the black man. Frederick Branch didn't just become an officer, he became a living revolution. But the ceiling didn't shatter all at once. It cracked, inch by inch. Following Branch came Frank E. Peterson. If Branch broke the officer barrier, Peterson broke the sky. In the early 1950s, the idea of a black Marine aviator was laughed at. The stereotype was that black men lacked the technical aptitude, the quick reflexes, and the right stuff to fly high-performance fighter jets. Peterson joined the Navy as an aviation cadet, the only black man in a sea of white faces. His journey was a gauntlet of sabotage and isolation. Instructors tried to wash him out. Maintenance crews would sometimes sabotage his equipment or ignore his requests, hoping he would crash. He flew with a target on his back, placed there by his own countrymen. But Peterson had the Montford Point spirit running through his veins. He refused to quit. He earned his wings. He transferred to the Marines and became the first black Marine aviator. Peterson flew 64 combat missions in Korea and over 300 in Vietnam. He was shot down, rescued, and went back up. He commanded a squadron, then an air group, then a major base. He faced racism at every rank, but his competence was a shield that bigotry couldn't penetrate. In 1979, Frank E. Peterson became the first African-American general in the United States Marine Corps. When the stars were pinned on his shoulder, it was the culmination of the long march that had begun in the mud of Montford Point 40 years earlier. The Supply Boys had produced a general. This evolution wasn't just happening at the top. It was changing the soul of the Corps from the bottom up. The black drill instructor became an icon of American military culture. In the late 50s and 60s, as the draft brought in waves of young men for Vietnam, thousands of white suburban kids found themselves stepping off the bus at Paris Island and looking up into the terrified, screaming face of a black drill instructor. Men like Sergeant Major Edgar Huff, who had been one of the first recruits at Montford Point, were now the gatekeepers of the Corps. For a racist white recruit, this was a shock to the system. His nightmare had come true. A black man owned him. But a strange alchemy happened in those platoons. The drill instructor was the father figure, the tormentor, and the god of the recruits' world. He taught them how to walk, how to talk, how to survive. By the time graduation day came, those white recruits didn't see a black man. They saw the man who made them Marines. They respected him more than they respected their own fathers. This dynamic did more to destroy racism in the hearts of young American men than any civil rights legislation ever could. You cannot hate the man who taught you how to be a man. However, the late 1960s brought a new challenge. The civil rights movement had shifted. The nonviolent resistance of Dr. King was giving way to the militant frustration of the Black Power movement. This tension bled into the barracks. Young black Marines, drafted from the burning streets of Detroit and Watts, were angry. They wore daps, elaborate handshakes, grew afros when they could get away with it, and openly challenged the authority of the white establishment. Racial violence broke out on bases like Camp Lejeune. The Montford Point veterans, the old salts, who were now sergeants major and master gunnery sergeants, found themselves in the middle. To the young black militants, these older men were Uncle Toms, sellouts who followed the white man's orders. To the white commanders, the old salts were the only hope of maintaining order. It was a painful, complex position. The Montford Pointers had to take these young, angry black Marines aside and school them. They had to tell them, "I know you're angry. I was angry before you were born. I marched through a swamp so you could stand here. Don't throw it away." They bridged the gap between the generations. They taught the young bloods that discipline was not submission. Discipline was a weapon. They showed them that the way to beat the system was to take it over, rank by rank. They saved the Marine Corps from imploding into a race war during the Vietnam era. Through the 1970s and 80s, the presence of black Marines normalized to the point of invisibility. It became unremarkable to see a black colonel or a black sergeant major. The Corps became known as the most diverse and meritocratic branch of the service. But in this normalization, the history of the struggle was almost lost. The new generation knew they belonged, but they didn't know why they belonged. They didn't know about the bears and the snakes of Montford Point. They didn't know about the 8th Ammunition Company on Iwo Jima. The Montford Point Marine Association kept the flame flickering. They were a small group of aging men, meeting in convention halls, wearing their distinctive red covers, hats. They were fighting a battle against dementia, against time, and against obscurity. They wanted one thing: for the Marine Corps to officially love them back. They didn't want charity. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted the history books corrected. They wanted the world to know that the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor belonged to them by right of conquest, not by the benevolence of integration. As the 21st century began, the urgency grew. The youngest Montford Point Marines were in their late 70s. The oldest were in their 90s. They were dying at a rate of dozens per month. The story was in danger of being buried with them. It took a concerted effort by historians, filmmakers, including the narrators of their own oral histories, and key figures within the military, to push the rock up the hill. The turning point came when the narrative shifted from civil rights history to American military history. When the story was framed not just as a struggle for equality, but as a triumph of Marine Corps values, honor, courage, commitment, it finally resonated with the leadership. The Corps realized that by ignoring Montford Point, they were ignoring one of the greatest examples of Semper Fidelis in their history. These men had remained faithful to a Corps that was not faithful to them. That is the ultimate definition of the motto. This realization paved the way for the final act of this drama. The push for the Congressional Gold Medal was launched. It required an act of Congress signed by the President. It required lobbying, letter writing, and the testimony of the few remaining survivors. Imagine an 88-year-old man walking with a cane, standing before a congressional committee. He is not bitter. He does not scream. He simply tells the story of 1942. He tells them about the cardboard huts. He tells them about the DUKWs on Iwo Jima. He tells them about coming home and being denied a cup of coffee. And he asks simply, "Did we not serve?" The answer, finally, was a resounding yes. In 2011, the legislation was passed unanimously. The date was set. June 27, 2012. Emancipation Hall in the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center. But for the surviving Montford Pointers, the medal itself was just a piece of metal. The real victory was something intangible. It was the lifting of the shame. For 70 years, many of them had carried a subtle, internalized shadow, the voice of the white drill instructor telling them they weren't good enough. The gold medal was the final exorcism of that voice. It was the nation saying, "You were the best of us." As we prepare to witness that ceremony in our minds, we must understand the scale of what was achieved. It wasn't just about 20,000 black men. It was about the redemption of the Marine Corps itself. The Montford Point Marines didn't just integrate the Corps, they perfected it. They forced it to live up to its own code. They washed the stain of racism out of the uniform with their own sweat and blood, leaving it cleaner for every Marine, black or white, who would wear it after them. The experiment had concluded. The result was gold. On June 27, 2012, the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., was filled with a sea of red. They were the distinctive crimson garrison caps of the Montford Point Marine Association, worn by men whose hair had turned to gray and white wool. There were nearly 400 of them present, a fraction of the 20,000 who had served. They came in wheelchairs. They came leaning heavily on canes. They came supported by the arms of grandchildren who looked at them with awe. Some were blind. Some were deaf. Many were frail, their bodies worn down by 90 years of life and the lingering aches of old wars. But when the Marine Corps band struck up the Marines' hymn, 400 spines stiffened, 400 heads lifted. For a moment, the years melted away, and they were back in the swamp, young, strong, and invincible. The symbolism of the venue was crushing. They were sitting in Emancipation Hall, a building named for the freedom of their ancestors, constructed in part by the labor of enslaved black people. Now, the descendants of those slaves, men who had fought to secure liberty for the world, were waiting for their country to finally pay a debt that was 7 decades overdue. When the leaders of the House and Senate and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General James Amos, took the stage, the silence in the room was heavy with history. General Amos looked out at the men. He didn't speak to them as a superior officer. He spoke to them as a humble successor. He acknowledged the stain on the history of the Corps. He admitted that the Marines had failed these men in 1942. And then he said the words that healed 70 years of invisible wounds. For all that you have done, and for all you have endured, thank you. You are the reason we are the Marine Corps we are today. When the Congressional Gold Medal was presented, a massive disc of gold featuring the Montford Point Marines charging up a beach on one side and standing in formation on the other, the reaction wasn't raucous cheering. It was a collective exhale. It was the sound of a burden being laid down. Tears streamed down faces that hadn't cried in front of white men since they were children. One veteran, clutching the replica medal to his chest, whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day. I just wanted my country to know I did my best." It wasn't just a medal. It was an apology. It was an admission that the United States of America had been wrong, and these men had been right. They had been right about their humanity. They had been right about their courage. They had been right to believe in the promise of America, even when America didn't believe in them. But the tragedy hung in the air alongside the triumph. For every man sitting in that hall, there were 50 who were not. They were the men buried in the black sands of Iwo Jima. They were the men who died of old age in the 1970s and 80s, thinking their service had been forgotten. They were the men who had taken off the uniform in 1946 and never put it back on because the pain of rejection was too great. The gold medal was for them too. It was a posthumous salute to the ghosts of the swamp. So, what is the final legacy of the Montford Point Marines? It goes far beyond the integration of the military. Their story is a masterclass in the power of excellence as a weapon of social change. They didn't integrate the Marine Corps by protesting outside the gates. They integrated it by kicking the door down with their performance. They forced the most rigid traditional institution in America to change its mind, not through moral arguments, but through the undeniable reality of their competence. They proved that you cannot argue with a man who is saving your life. They taught us that patriotism is not a passive act of flag waving, It is an active, sometimes combative, demand for the country to live up to its own creed. They loved America enough to fight for it when it hated them. That is a love so fierce and so complex that it is almost impossible to comprehend. It is the love of a parent for a wayward child, a love that disciplines and corrects. Today, the United States Marine Corps is fundamentally different because of them. When a black general commands a division, he is standing on the bedrock laid by the men of the 8th Ammunition Company. When a black female drill instructor screams at a recruit, her voice echoes the growl of Hashmark Johnson. They are the founding fathers of the modern diverse military. They took the motto Semper Fidelis, always faithful, and they lived it when the country was unfaithful to them. They redefined the code. But their lesson extends to every single one of us, civilian or soldier. We all face our own Montford points. We all face moments where the system seems rigged, where the gatekeepers tell us we don't belong, where the conditions are set up for us to fail. We face swamps of doubt and mountains of prejudice. The Montford Point Marines tell us, build your shelter in the swamp. Master your craft. Be so good they cannot ignore you. And when they finally let you into the fight, don't just participate, take over. We are living in a world they built. We walk through doors they opened. We enjoy freedoms they paid for in blood and humiliation. The debt we owe them cannot be repaid with a medal, or a statue, or a video. It can only be repaid by how we live. It can only be repaid by refusing to let the darkness of prejudice return. It can only be repaid by remembering. The last of the Montford Point Marines are leaving us now. They are passing into the final formation. The final muster is calling them home. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers the smell of the swamp in 1942 or the sound of the mortars on Iwo Jima. The living memory will become history, and history is fragile. It can be rewritten. It can be erased. It can be forgotten. That is why you are here. That is why you watch this. You are now the keeper of the flame. You are the witness. When you hear someone say that this country was built only by one type of person, you have the ammunition to tell them the truth. You can tell them about the men who carried the ammo on Iwo Jima. You can tell them about the men who froze in Korea. You can tell them about the men who walked through hell to earn the title Marine. They said a black man couldn't be a Marine. They said he would run. They said he would break. The Montford Point Marines looked the world in the eye and said, "Watch me." They are the giants upon whose shoulders we stand. They turned the iron of their chains into the gold of their medals. They fought 2 wars, one against tyranny abroad and one against racism at home, and they won them both. Don't let their story end here. Don't let the algorithm bury this truth. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with your children. Share it with the world. Let's make sure that the name Montford Point is never spoken in a whisper again, but shouted with the reverence it deserves. They were the chosen few. They were the first. And because of them, they will never be the last. Thank you for watching.